In this lesson I will teach you about another feature that your camera has for controlling exposure. It's called exposure compensation, and today you'll learn how to use it to increase your exposure when your subject is too dark. To make a good photo, the sensor needs to receive the right amount of light. Too much light hitting the sensor and your photos are overexposed. Not enough light and they are underexposed. When you are using one of the auto or semi-auto exposure modes, the camera controls the amount of light for each exposure. This is very smart technology, but it's not so creative and sometimes it's just not very accurate. At times you will have too much light reaching your sensor from the background and your main subject will appear too dark, underexposed. You have probably noticed this in some of your photos as you've been working through the challenges, particularly the ones where I have instructed you to photograph towards a bright light or bright background. Using the exposure compensation setting on your camera, you can override the choice of exposure the camera makes when it's on any of the auto or semi-automatic settings. There is still a certain amount of guesswork involved in getting a good exposure this way. If you've taken a dark photo using any of the auto exposure modes, you can adjust the exposure compensation setting and take a photo again. Dialing in exposure compensation towards the plus symbol will lighten your exposure. Choose a dark subject with strong backlighting, where there's strong light behind your subject and it's in the shade. Take a few photos on program, aperture priority or shutter priority mode. See if you're getting some photos where your subject is too dark or underexposed and the background is very bright. Then adjust your exposure compensation to +2, which allows for more light to enter and affect the sensor. Your exposure compensation button looks something like this. You'll need to press it and turn a dial. Check your camera manual or online to find out how. Make a few more photos and compare them. This exercise may be more difficult for some than others, as each camera will give a different result depending on the lighting conditions. Please experiment. The aim of these challenges is to help you to understand how your camera functions and just get a feel for it. I'm sure you're not taking perfect photos yet, but don't worry about that. Just enjoy the learning process and in no time at all you'll be taking fantastic photos. The more of a feel you can have for your camera, the better photographer you will be, because this will allow you to concentrate on photography rather than just on the camera. Key points from this lesson are: to make a good photo, the sensor needs to receive the right amount of light. Using the exposure compensation setting on your camera, you can override the choice of exposure the camera makes. Strong backlighting can cause a subject to appear too dark. In this lesson, we'll look at another way of using exposure compensation. You'll learn to use it to decrease your exposure when your subject is too bright. In situations where you take a photo using an auto exposure mode and the subject is too bright, overexposed, you need to use exposure compensation to decrease the amount of light on your subject. You will need to use this setting when you're in very bright conditions like at the beach or when you're in the snow. With your camera in aperture priority mode, using exposure compensation will alter your shutter speed. In shutter priority mode, it will adjust your aperture. In program mode, it usually alters your shutter speed, although this may vary from camera to camera. You'll need to check your settings once you have dialed in the amount of compensation you want, especially when using aperture priority or program mode and you're already using a slow shutter speed. You do not want your shutter speed to be too slow unless you're using a tripod. Using exposure compensation requires a degree of guesswork to get it right. It can also be fiddly to adjust on some cameras. Taking this additional step slows down the process of taking photos, and it's necessary to know how to use it if you want to take photos using any of the auto or semi-auto modes. For today's photo, you'll need to have your subject in bright sun with a background that is dark and shaded from the sun, or be at the beach, in a desert, or in the snow on a sunny day. So I've got a nice light coloured subject. It's quite sunny, it's quite hot out here, and the background's nice and dark. It's all in the shade, so I'm going to take some photos with the normal setting and then using exposure compensation. The background must make up a large part of your composition. With your subject in the bright sun and a large part of your composition in the shade, take a few photos. If you have well-exposed photos, you may not have enough contrast in the composition. So find a different location or compose your photos so the subject is taking up less of the frame. You're aiming to see how your subject can be overexposed, too bright, in situations like this. Once you have a subject that's looking too bright, adjust your exposure compensation to -1 and take a photo, and then -2 and take another photo, and compare the results. And the aim with making these photos is more to get a feel for your camera and how you can control the different settings. These are some of the more technical basics, and once you've got a feel for these, we'll be able to get into some of the more interesting, fun photography. Key points from this lesson are: you can use exposure compensation when your subject is too bright. Using exposure compensation requires a degree of guesswork to get it right. In the last few lessons we looked at exposure compensation, and in this lesson I'll teach you some techniques about how you can avoid having to use it. By choosing the right location to take your photos and composing them carefully, you can avoid using exposure compensation. The reason your camera will not always give you a good exposure is because the camera has a limited ability to record detail in the bright and the dark areas. This is most noticeable in situations where the light is bright and strong and contrast is high, like in the middle of the day on a sunny day. Our eyes are able to see more detail in the bright and dark areas of a scene than our cameras are. Our cameras are more limited and cannot record such a wide range of light. Cloudy days and areas where the light is soft and flat, it's easier to get a well-exposed photograph without having to dial in exposure compensation. When you're taking photos, pay attention to the contrast range in your composition. The more even the light and tones are, the less you'll need to have to use exposure compensation. Taking photos in bright light, try and avoid including any areas of dark shadow. When you're taking photos in the shade, avoid including any bright areas in your composition. Making these choices about how you compose your photos will help you avoid having to use exposure compensation. Your photos will be more evenly exposed because the tone range in them is narrower. The aim of this challenge is to help you gain a better understanding of how your camera manages contrast in a scene and why a more evenly toned composition will help you avoid having to use exposure compensation. Photograph a subject that's in the shade and where the whole of your composition is in the shade. Next, photograph a subject that's in the sun and where the whole of your composition is in the sun. So here I have my subject completely in the shade, so the light is very even. So here I've got my pot plants in the sun to photograph, and the background and the subjects are both in the sun. So again, we are avoiding using exposure compensation on this photo. When your subject and your background are affected by the same light, your camera should have no trouble making a series of well-exposed photos. Compare the two types of result, taking note especially of the shadow areas. Using any of the auto or semi-auto exposure modes, your camera will not always make the right calculation to expose your photos the way you want. A lot of the time though, you'll not have a problem and will not need to use exposure compensation. I hope you're getting a real feel for your camera and how it captures images in different types of light using the different exposure modes. Key points from this lesson are: location and lighting can help avoid the need for using exposure compensation. When contrast is low, using exposure compensation is not usually necessary.